Hey guys, this is miicrow here. I wanted to make a video and kind of go through every weapon and then see what changes are coming to these weapons from the beta build that just recently ended. And as well as that, there's some data mined stuff that I want to talk about too that has a kind of a big impact in terms of how PvP plays, and then we'll see like what people think about it. I think it would some of these changes are definitely impactful. Some of the others are like a little bit more minor, but they're generally like pretty big changes that are coming. So starting off here, the way that we're going through this is a neural database. I'm showing the current build on the left. On the right is the PTR, aka the open beta build, and there's some things on there that have changed. There might be a few things that I missed, but this is kind of like what I've gone through and like what I've seen. So starting off here with Flail, there's been no change to these trees or the Flail itself, except for how the UI changes. So they've changed like the purple coloring to be red coloring. The purple coloring was like kind of like a hybrid between damage and healing, where healing was green, damage was red, and then I don't think red and green make purple. I think it's blue and red make purple, but they went with purple in the past. Now they're changing that to be a red color. They changed the orange color, which is supposed to be like a more defensive, like tanky kind of thing, to be red for more attack oriented stuff and blue for more defensive oriented stuff. They're just trying to simplify that color UI, I think, but nothing really big has changed here in terms of the flail. Greatsword, there's been a new weapon tree that's been introduced here. So if you look at the right side, you can get access to this roaring rupture a little bit sooner. You also don't have the option to choose between intimidating roar and adaptive rupture. You just have to go into intimidating roar. I know some greatsword players actually like this change a lot, because then you can go into roaring rupture sooner and you can like avoid taking an extra passive on this defensive tree, which people didn't like to take. A decent amount of people also just don't play with Throwing Rupture with Greatsword, and they prefer to go with Steadfast Strike as sort of a finisher move. So if you're playing with the Steadfast Strike variant, I don't think there's really much of a change here. If you're playing with the Roaring Rupture variant, which used to be more popular and was a little bit slower, and I think it's generally better if you're going for heavy attack builds. And because we're kind of going to be going into more heavy attack build meta, because of the 300 con change, I imagine this will be a little bit better, and then you can pick up another DPS passive here on the left side, which is kind of nice. So overall, kind of beneficial to Greatsword players who might gain an extra attribute point there. Sword had a few new changes. So first off, the big thing is reverse stab gets replaced with upheaval. Now on paper, upheaval is one of the highest damaging abilities in the game. In practice on the open beta, its hitbox wasn't that great and it felt a little bit clunky, so people weren't using it. I imagine someone will figure out some sort of build to like really get a lot of value out of this, but it seems like this has like a high potential just because it has 200 base scaling multiplier, so everything just gets scaled by a gigantic, I can't think right now, amount, and it's just allowing people to do a lot more damage in theory. We'll see in practice how this goes. They've also changed the weapon tree here a little bit. So if you look at the right side, you can see the shield bash is one tree higher up, so you could access that sooner. I don't think this really changes many builds because you just generally want to get to the physical armor because it's like a good passive to get. So that doesn't really change that much. In terms of like the passive you had to pick up, like I guess you had to pick up elemental resistance or high grip or shield rush now, but that's not really a problem because you always kind of wanted one of those. There's also a change to this final countdown perk, where depending on the type of shield that you have a different passive there. So if you're looking at the live variant, it's just if your health's above 50%, your damage reductions increase by 20%. And it's one of the reasons why this Defender Resolve is so good for tanky weapons. Now that passive is still going to be kept for those tanky weapons, but that 50% health cooldown threshold has been removed, so you can use this at low HP and still get the benefit. Kite shields will reduce the potency of slows that you have by 30% while it's active, which isn't like a bad passive, but like also like no one's gonna use SNS with a kite shield. Like I guess if you want to go SNS flail and heavy, like you could, but it's just not really a thing right now. And with round shield, you gain additional base damage while this is active. Defender's Resolve just always has been like a really underrated ability. Recently it's got changed, so it works immediately when it's activated before you had to like wait a bit. So like one of the weird techs with this ability is it's actually better to use this ability right before you get stunned than when you normally would, because if you get stunned, you get the ability proc, then the stun takes you out of the long animation, and then if someone hits you, you go out of the stun animation. So there's like situations in PvP where this build or ability is actually weirdly really good. And as a tank and like as other players, I think it's just an underrated thing. Like you need Leaping Strike, you need Shield Rush in my opinion with these builds. That you don't really need Shield Bash, but it's a nice ability to have, and like that last slot is a little bit more optional, and I think in situations this ability could be picked up on as well. Do we talk about one with the shield yet? That's the only other one, so no, I did not talk about this. One with the shields also got changed, so this before was just like, whenever you block, all your cooldowns are reduced by 1%. Now that passive has been moved to kite shields, which kind of sucks for tanks, because that was like a really, really nice passive to have. But knowing me, like as a tank player that plays a lot of tanks, I'm probably still going to be running Refreshing Ward, even though that's capped out at like 625 gear score now, because lowering your gear score actually still makes you tankier and makes you deal more damage weirdly, because the devs didn't really implement that correctly. So you are taking a hit here. It is nice to have that CDR passive. With Tower Shield now, it's just if you get hit, you will extend the duration of all the buffs on you by 5%. The interesting thing here is, I believe there is an activation cooldown with this. That's something that actually might be kind of interesting to check. If I pull up New World Buddy and look at one with the shield. This is how one way to data mine stuff. No, there's no activation cooldown on this. Okay, that's really interesting then, because what this means, because there's no activation cooldown, is if you get hit by a bunch of attacks at once, it will just keep multiplying by 5%, right? So if I get hit by a Blunderbuss, that's technically, because the Blunderbuss shoots 6 pellets at once, that counts as 6 individual hits, which will extend all the buffs on you by 30%. So this is actually like situationally really good now. So that's kind of noteworthy, something that I might mess around with from a tank perspective. With round shields, hitting a target will increase the duration of all debuffs on them by 5%. That's basically just not a super great perk. Usually when you're extending debuffs, I don't think it's super impactful. I guess if you're like have a bunch of people spamming attacks on someone, maybe you can like root chain them forever or something silly like that. But I don't think it's realistic to get that many attacks off to really see that passive kind of take over the game. Now the other thing that's kind of noteworthy too, is if you look at these passives, so it says requirement round shield. Does it say on equip, or does it say something else here? So no, it doesn't say on equip. So this should only work with your SNS out. The main thing I'm checking here is that to see if this will work with your offhand out, because some of the Flail passives they actually work with your other weapon when they're out too, which can be nice in some instances. So like this hitting a target will increase the duration of debuffs on by 5%. Like say this worked while you had a Blunderbuss out or something like that. That would be really, really good. But it looks like the weapon tag, you have to have the sword. It looks like you have to have the round shield. So I would expect that to not be the case here. Moving on to Rapier. Rapier has a new tree, but there's nothing major that has changed here. You can see like the evade tree like looks a little bit different, but they really just smushed everything together. And other than that, like they've just moved some stuff that was on the right to the left and like up a slot. I don't think this really changes anything that people take. Like I guess you don't have to take the stamper hit now, so maybe it frees up like one passive. I don't imagine this will make a big change in anything, but there's a potential that you can get like one extra passive here for the Rapier. That being said, most people that run the Rapier use it for defensives, not for offensives, with the exception of some like PvE oriented DPS builds. And for those people, you don't really care about a lot of the passives on the Rapier. Like, you only need, like, 14 points into the Rapier to get every passive you really want, and everything else is kind of, like, extra. So I don't think this will be a big deal, unlike the Greatsword, where every passive, like, really matters a lot. Moving on to Firestaff here. There's been some buffs to Firestaff. The major one is with Meteor Shower. They have been given a passive disease effect. I forget where it is here. Yeah, it's Immolation. So this is, like, a passive disease effect now. So they got rid of that grit on Meteor Shower, but they put it up here. So what did they get rid of? Okay, so they got rid of the mana passive on Meteor Shower. So you're going to have to juggle the mana a little bit more. The passive disease is actually insane. This makes Firestaff like basically mandatory for any like large scale content. And small scale, you're not really going to be looking for Meteor Showers for like for that FFA island. Like, I wouldn't expect Firestaff just to run Meteor Shower because they're just not going to be hitting a large amount of targets, which is what Meteor Shower is kind of designed to do. That being said, Firestaff looks like it's in a very good spot. They did nerf Fireball in terms of PvP, so this is previously 150. Now it's 150, and it's an additional 20% base damage to hostile AI targets. But if you look at the Empowering Fireball perk, you could see that there's a pretty big nerf here. So we go from 58% to targets above 50% health to 14% damage and an additional 21% to targets above 50% health. So that's a very big nerf there. Kind of necessary, but I don't think Fireball is the main reason why Firestaff was so good, but it definitely helped Firestaff. The other noteworthy thing too is Nature's Wrath is an item that's worn by most Firestaffs in the game, and this got changed as well. So the way that this worked with Firestaff in the past was it basically functioned as a free 20% extra damage because all the empowers from Firestaffs weren't actually coded as empowers. And the code itself, the empower status wasn't really applied to them, and it was conditional based off other things. So it's just a free 20% more damage basically. And now that is getting reduced within Nature's Wrath at the upcoming change. I imagine most people will just change off of Nature's Wrath here, and they'll go to something like Winged Leather shoes, which just gives you a free 10% base damage while you're hasted. And then there's ways to get basically permanent haste with this up and coming patch. With things where if you get hit by someone or if you hit someone with a dot effect, there's like a haste involved. So there's like a lot of like easy ways to get this to proc, and you lose some damage, but you gain a lot of benefits in terms of haste, duration being increased, and also the damage is nice. So there's like alternatives there for Firestaff to kind of get around. Lifestaff had some interesting changes. Most of these, so there's like some tree stuff here that changed. Splash of Light has a new passive that knocks people back, which is kind of crazy. So you could use Splash of Light when people are on you, heal everyone in your group, it'll knock them back off of you a bit. So it was already a really, really good ability, and it just got better. Imagine this will be mandatory for the majority of Lifestaffs in most game modes now. And any time you have like a few people on you, it seems just really, really nice. Also, there's a new passive with a heavy attack with Lifestaff that now it applies a pushback, which is a little bit weird to data mine. But if you go to New World Buddy, and then you look at the Lifestaff heavy spell thing, which is kind of a weird, then you could see that this applies an effect now, and that it was like a knockback like effect. I believe it was that other one. There's also this one here. It's like that is coded similarly. This isn't really documented super well, but there's a way for Lifestaffs just to use heavies to knock people back now. If you use a heavy with the Lifestaff, you also gain a passive effect that increases how strong your heals are. I think this is good for Lifestaffs because before it was just a class that just spammed left click to reduce cooldowns, and now you have like a little bit more of a benefit for going for a right click every now and then. I don't imagine this will change too much, but at least it's a little bit more involved for this class in terms of you don't just think, okay, I just need to press my left click here and I just need to time my heals. Now it's like a little bit more decisions for that class to make, which is always good. Now moving on to Bow here. Bow didn't really have a ton of interesting changes. They got like a new tree in terms of the loadout, so you see Evade Shot gets moved down a little bit. You see Rain of Arrows gets moved up a bit. In general, with these trees, they shook it up a bit, but they didn't change much of it. They changed the colors, obviously. There was a recent nerf to Poison Shot, but that wasn't between these two builds, so that should be a little bit less oppressive than it used to be if you guys are just getting back to the game. There's also a change to Evade Shots Go to Distance here, where this used to be a free 15% haste, to now it's a conditional 15% haste. You have to hit a target with that Evade Shot to actually get the haste to proc. So that's a little bit interesting. Bows typically are like kind of a exploity kind of class where you look for animation cancels everywhere that you can. So like Rain of Arrows has often been ran as a way just to use a consistent animation cancel instead of just using it for the Rain of Arrows itself. I don't think that is likely going to change. There's some stuff with that, like new engine that might change some of these interactions, and there might be a new animation cancel that gets discovered. But the base concept of Bow being a class that just like looks to use auto attacks as much as possible, use the Bolt Caster to deal really high amounts of damage when you are hitting a lot of attacks on a single target, and just overall just doing good single target damage and being survivable in terms of a range class, which most range classes are not. I don't think will change. There will be some interesting interactions here with like the new stam change, where if you get hit by a stagger effect when your stam bar isn't full, then you can't dodge, you can't block, which will make bow inherently a little bit harder to play. But even in those spots, all this does is it just makes Rapier even more mandatory. You just use a Rapier to get away, and you should be fine. So bow's in a pretty similar spot to where it was. Warhammer had some changes. There's a new tree here, and a guarded spirit passive changed as well. So this used to be 10% while walking, running, and sprinting. Now this is just 10% while sprinting. So a little bit of a nerf there to the Warhammer. Warhammer will inherently just be really strong because of the 300 con change, which I wanted to talk about towards the end of the video. But honestly, this seems like a good time to introduce this. 300 con has been changed from being all basic attacks gain grit to while charging and performing heavy attacks to gain grit. And the best weapon that uses heavy attacks is Warhammer. So Warhammer is going to be in a really good spot no matter what, even with this adjustment. And for the most part, these other abilities also have grit. So if you are annoyed about people hitting you, Warhammer is the way to go. I imagine Warhammer will be taking over in terms of PvE tank builds because it does a good amount of stam damage. It can pull aggro, and you have grit every time you're going for a heavy attack, and it's really, really annoying to play PvE as a tank without grit. And because AGS has changed how grit works, those other options are just not as viable compared to Warhammer in that endgame PvE, from an endgame PvE standpoint. Moving on to Musket here, the class that benefits the most from the target lock. So Musket, they get a new tree, they get powder burn nerfs, which is good because the dot effect is so annoying, and they, for some reason, have not added Cleanse Pod as a consumable that you can craft in the game. So you don't have a good way to counter this. I imagine Musket will be hard meta for the FFA Island and will be used by teams of people teaming up on the FFA Island, so look out. It will hit really, really hard. You get those 50 extra attribute bonuses now, so you can dump everything that you want to into int. If you want to do more ability damage, you could dump everything you want to into dex if you want to do or have a higher chance of critting, which will also do a bit more damage with this class. So you just have a lot going for you for the Musket for this next patch. Expect it to be very, very good and annoying in open world, but don't expect it to be used everywhere, just because the Musket does have the downside of if you get caught and someone's on top of you, you don't have a good chance of escaping, unlike the bow. The bow will allow you to kind of disengage a little bit better than the Musket, but in terms of just being in a kind of a hidden spot and just destroying someone, taking all their loot, and kind of getting off for free on that FFA Island, Musket will definitely be good for that. So look out. Hatchet is in a really good spot because of the 300 con change, because Berserk gives you grit, so it's going to be really good. Anything large scale though, Berserk can be stripped from Void Gauntlet, so I don't expect it to be used. That being said, a Void Gauntlet is really only used in war, if you think about it, and it's not used in OPR, it's not used in open world. It's generally just a utility weapon, so I think Hatchet's actually going to be really, really strong with the up-and-coming patch. With the change to where you have target lock now, you could roll behind somebody, look for a feral rush, and then you can lock them in place, which would be kind of crazy. That being said, I don't know if someone like locks onto you and you lock onto them if you go behind them, if they spin their character model around. That's something I didn't really get to experiment a lot with, but I think Hatchet will be strong. There aren't really any major changes to the Hatchet. Like you could see that Raging Torrent got moved up a spot, so like it looks new, but it's not really new. It's just slightly new. And the colors got changed like the other stuff, so that damage effects are red, although Berserk isn't really a damage effect, it's more of a status effect, but they changed that color to be red anyway, so that's something that's a little bit new there. Blunderbuss is the weapon that has cried so much for getting buffs for a very long time, has still not gotten buffs, and the main reason why people complained about it not getting buffed is because they basically reduced its damage modifier by a lot in a PvP oriented update, and then they got rid of this ammo thing, which also is going to reduce all the weapons that have ammo. So Musket, Blunderbuss, bow. Is there anything else that uses ammo? I don't think there's anything else that uses ammo. All those weapons take a little bit of a nerf because they get an extra 20% base damage instead of the ammo multiplicative bonus. This will nerf your damage by about 5 to 10%. With how much base damage those builds actually run, so it's going to be a little bit less oppressive. That being said, with target lock, Blunderbuss is like the best character thing to run with target lock. Like, you could target lock onto someone, just focus on movement, and you could hit every shot. And it's really a class that focuses on hitting your pellets. AGS has talked about like how headshot modifier is important for things, but if you look at any Blunderbuss, you realize that the headshot modifier is basically worthless. So look at one of these. It's a 1.15 critical damage modifier. So it's not even going to do extra damage versus light players. Like, it is basically pointless to go for headshots with Blunderbuss, and this will just enable Blunderbuss players to do a bit more, which I think is good because Blunderbuss is kind of a not really used weapon. The main thing that's used at the moment is just because net shot is like stupid strong, but everything else is like kind of mid. So just look out for the target lock with the Blunderbusses, but new tree is basically everything it got there. Greataxe got a new tree, nothing really noteworthy here. It'll be really interesting to see how this class varies with the 300 con change. I wouldn't be surprised to see a lot more like whirlwinding based Greataxe builds, because that actually has grit, and people probably are going to be annoyed from auto attacking. It will be interesting too to see if people like want to get off of Maulers and try to go back to Bloodlust, because Maulers will feel a little bit weird if you can't just spam light attacks. Like, if you have to spam like heavy attacks, Maulers just inherently loses value. If you're spamming light attacks and you get hit by like a spear or something like that, that could be kind of annoying, because spears have a lot of ways of putting you on the ground with some knockdown effect. If you don't have grit, you can't counter that, so that will be kind of interesting. But nothing too remarkable here from a Greataxe standpoint. Ice Gauntlet got some new trees. It's actually really nice for Ice Gauntlet because they move Ice Storm up, so it frees another point, so you can put it wherever you want. So like I normally go a full utility like Ice Gauntlet tree, so this is like what I ran on the left, and this is what I would be running on the right. So that's going to be in a really good spot. Critical Rejuvenation got a bit of a change. So this used to be 15 mana every time you crit a target, to now 15% of your max mana whenever you crit a target. So either a buff if you run focus, or no change if you don't really. Restoring 5% of your max mana whenever you hit a target with a heavy attack is the different thing there. The main thing this worked off of was Ice Pile, and that was the main reason why it ever got value. So I don't think there's like a huge change here functionally. Like, it's not really that noteworthy, but you do have that passive freed up to go wherever you want to for next patch. The other big thing with the Ice Gauntlet is, if we go back to like kind of our data mining side with New Road Buddy, Ice Gauntlet got a new heavy attack passive. So if you go for a heavy attack with an Ice Gauntlet, it applies a slow effect, which will reduce the movement speed by 10%. And this is for a maximum of 6 seconds, but its base duration is 3 seconds, so it's going to be a 3-second slow. So you get that 1 second root. They come out of that root and are going to be slowed for a bit. So you combo your Ice Storm into your heavy attack from Ice Gauntlet, and people are just not going to be having a great time. But that being said, like, I think Ice Spike probably won't be meta still, because Ice Spike is like super conditional with its damage being if the target is rooted, and there's just been a lot of ways to counter roots lately. Like, unless you could find a way to like stagger lock someone so they can't dodge because of either that new mechanic and bug, and then go for an Ice Spike, like that might be a way to get value with this. So if you like say someone's like below 50% on their bar, right, and you go for a Void Gauntlet Scream, now they can't dodge, then you go to Ice Gauntlet and you go for your Ice Spike, like that would work, like the OG Ice Spike builds. But in terms of just playing Ice Gauntlet by itself, you don't really have a way to do a stagger effect, so I don't imagine this is going to be super prevalent. That being said, I will be very happy if Ice Spike returns, because Ice Spike was very, very fun to play at the time. So moving on here to one of our last weapons, we have Void Gauntlet. Void Gauntlet actually has a few big changes. So they don't have like any change to the tree itself, but again, going back to data mining, Void Gauntlet has a new passive to where it could actually hit through targets. And this is really interesting because there's a lot of passives built into the Void Gauntlet that like you would think would benefit from this. So this whole right side of the tree for Void Gauntlet for the longest time has basically just not been used. So if I use Leeching Bolts now, like healing from ranged heavy attacks, that will be a thing that can apply to multiple targets. Noteworthy that all of the heal effects on here have a 0.1 second activation cooldown, so there has to be 0.1 seconds between the projectile going through players. That being said, it is a projectile, so it is possible to get this to proc multiple times. I just think it's like not super likely. But hey, if you're a Void Gauntlet player, just send your right click, or not your right click, send your heavy attack through a clump, and you might get some value there. The other passives that don't have an activation cooldown, so this Extended Suffering doesn't have an activation cooldown, so this will always work with a heavy attack and will collat. and this deadly range always work with heavy attacks and clat. Like, maybe we'll come to the point where we start seeing glimpses of the Void builds back. The thing I know about the Void Gauntlet Heavy Attack, though, is it's a really big hitbox, but it's, like, weirdly hard to hit sometimes, just because it's, like, a very long charge up. It would be nice to see if this actually gets used once again, but I wouldn't say that you should go all in on, like, a Void Gauntlet heavy attack spam build. Like, Void Gauntlet, as its core, is a utility class. It is a setup class. You're looking to strip people's buffs. You're looking to apply disease. You're looking to apply unique rend effects, and that's the main thing it's good at and the main thing it's known for. Moving on to Spear here. Spear's in a really, really good spot because of the con change. Your effects like Sweep actually have grip built into them, and this can knock people down, so it's like just a hard counter for a lot of melee builds now, so it'll be really interesting. That being said, in like a 1v1 kind of environment, a spear doesn't really do as well because it doesn't close distance. It's a good offhand, like you need to find a way to get closer, which is why it's often paired with SNS, because SNS is really good at closing distance and spear is good at finishing people off. So I imagine it will get used to some capacity, but if I'm looking at like a 1v1 at this next patch, like Hatchet looks pretty good. SNS is always going to be mandatory until Leaping Strike is changed, so I don't really know where spear fits besides like kind of mid to large scale content. So if you're a solo player, like I wouldn't put all your eggs in the basket with spear, but it's a very, very good weapon if used properly. Very good in medium. In heavy, it's a little bit less oppressive, but it's still strong. And in light, you're a glass cannon. So that will be interesting. You also have the extra attribute bonuses, right? So it can benefit you a bit. Like before you had to go 300 dex. Usually you went for 200 con and then you went for 100 strength. Now you can get up to 150 strength if you want to keep 200 con, or you can get up to 200 strength if you go to 150 con, which I think a lot of people will be trying to do. And maybe you could even do something like you use the attuned leather pants, which give you a little bit of extra stats, and you might just be able to squeak over the 700 mark there, because you would have 615 stats as a base, and then you gain a little bit of extra stats from using that attuned leather pants, which I believe is like about 30 extra stats. So you're like really, really close. I don't think it quite gets there, but it's like very interesting if it does. That being said, tumbler boots are fantastic with spear, and you're probably going to be wanting to use those because every time you dodge, you reduce your spear cooldowns if you hit someone with that attack. So it's like spear is always going to be good just because of that. I think it will kind of remain that way for a while. Let me know what you guys think about the classes as a whole in terms of their updates or kind of lack thereof, to be honest, for the most part. Like some of these have like kind of hidden updates, like all the Void Gauntlet, the Ice Gauntlet, and the Lifestaff have like that hidden heavy change, which is kind of cool, but everything else seems like about the same where it was. We have stuff like the Meteor Shower that got changed. It's kind of interesting. The part that like mostly frustrates me is there's like some of this stuff is like I had to like look like deep into the code. Like I had to look into the damage rows. I had to throw like random filters on, and like if I get rid of these filters, like it is actually impossible to find the thing that you're looking for. Like you could comb through this for hours and you wouldn't be able to find anything that you're looking for, but we were able to find that, which is kind of nice. But let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you guys in the next video.